So, China Miéville, welcome to the fifth edition of the Barcelona Fantastic Genres Festival.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's a pleasure for us to explore your work through various activities, culminating in this conversation. So, on behalf of the festival, thank you for accepting this interview.
Thank you. It's been a long time that you and I have been discussing various possibilities. So I'm really glad to be able to finally chat.
Yeah. So, I'm sure all of those who are watching now know about your career, but just in case, and considering that it would be impossible to summarize all of your achievements in a few lines, here's a hype brief intro. Our guest is a best-selling author of fiction and nonfiction, winner of the Arthur C. Clarke Award, the World Fantasy Award, the Hugo Award, and the British Science Fiction Award, among others. His work crosses different formats and genres, from novels like King Rat, the Baslack Trilogy, Unlundun, The City and the City, Kraken, Embassy Town, Railsea, and The Book of Elsewhere, to collections of stories like Looking for Jake and Three Moments of an Explosion, novellas like The Tame, This Census Taker, and The Last Days of New Paris, or comics like Dial H. Among his nonfiction, one can highlight October, the story of the Russian Revolution, and Spectre Hunting on the Communist Manifesto. His novel, The City and the City, was adapted by the BBC in 2018 and is now available on streaming on Amazon Prime. So here we are, so let's start. Your latest work translated into Spanish and Catalan is The Book of Elsewhere, published by Océano Gran Travesía, in collaboration with Keanu Reeves. Inspired by the comic Bizarre, you've stated that this book should not be considered a mere novelization of the comic. Aside from the main character, what has been the biggest challenge in tackling this project to avoid it becoming a simple novelization?
Well, to be honest, it wasn't particular. I mean, there were challenges, but that wasn't in particular a challenge, largely because of the way Keanu Reeves approaches this, because he, created this character and this world berserker, but what he likes doing is kind of collaborating with artists and writers and so on, and he's always interested in people's take on his idea. So the way I always put it is that it's like he's created a sand pit and he's put his toys in it, and then he invites different people in and says, what game can you play with the toys? So there was never, as opposed to saying, these are my toys and this is how we play, And so there was never a problem of like, when he originally approached me, I mean, I was very flattered and I was very interested, but I wondered whether this would be a question of simply, either novelizing the comic or writing something that kind of took the comic as a very clear starting point and then moved on from it. But very quickly, he said, no, what he wanted was like our take on this idea, on this basic idea. So he had a few sort of non-negotiables, a few things that were set. And then beyond that, we could do anything that we wanted, which was not what I was expecting, and was very was really exciting. Was one of the reasons I said yes. This is not, as I say, this is not just not a novelization of the comic. It also isn't a novel set exactly in the universe of the comic. It's a version. It's a variant, if you like. And each of the things that he does, he's interested in doing variant versions. So this is our, and he wanted, and I wanted, to do things in the novel that you can do specifically in a novel that don't lend themselves so well to a video game or a movie or a comic. So this was never going to be just a kind of an attempt to replicate the same thing. So, a novel has its own sense of pace. It has its own sense of interiority. There are things that you can do with a comic, like you can make spectacular violence rather beautiful in a way that I think is more difficult in a novel. You can depict violence, but it doesn't work in the same way. So we wanted to do specific things, and that's why the novel has the shape it has. And he was tremendously sort of generous and open to all of these ideas. And I think both of us wanted to do something that would, I mean, obviously we want people to like it, but also we want it to surprise people. So it's like if you've read the comic, this is not going to be what you expect. Now, hopefully in a good way, but it's very important that it's not just you're doing the same thing in 4 different ways. We're trying to do something different each time. All of which is to say, on that aspect, there were no particular difficulties. There were other difficulties, but not that one.
Something very interesting is the central character, Unit B, which is thousands of years old, immortal, with perfect memory and extraordinary capabilities like a superhuman or a god. His search for mortality reflects a deep existential concern. He cannot choose if or when he wants to die, as destiny has taken this away from him. Additionally, he seems incapable of managing his vast memories. Does he personify the individual that technology is making us into, overwhelmed by stimuli and information, with the ability to extend life through multiple virtual spaces?
I mean, not deliberately and consciously. And I'm going to say that a lot during this conversation. I'm very committed to the idea that, my ideas about what I do are not the final ideas. So I can answer like, what was intentional, but if I don't see something, that doesn't necessarily mean it's not there. In this case, I really like your formulation about managing his memories. I think that's really perspicacious, because one of the things that that Keanu has about this character is that not only is he incredibly old, he's 80,000 years old, but he has, quote, a perfect memory. He never forgets anything that happens when he's conscious. And that's a very tricky thing for narrative, because often narrative revolves around discovering something or learning something that you hadn't known, or that was, or like remembering something or whatever. But if you remember every single thing that happens to you, and and that presented quite an interesting challenge, talking of challenges. So the thing you're talking about like overwhelm and that sense of, kind of multiple sort of fractal versions of ourselves. I mean, obviously I can see that there are certain specific ways that is particularly kind of accelerated and pregnant at the moment in terms of digital spaces and so on. But actually, for me, that's a kind of metastasizing of tendencies that were always there. And particularly, as you know, if you've read the book opens with a discussion between B and Freud. And one of the key things about, the Freudian and post-Freudian way of looking at the self is that there's multiplicities within it. And, memories are real, but they're not necessarily accurate recordings. So that allowed one way in to me saying, I'm not changing the rules. He has a perfect memory, but what does that mean? What are you doing with your memories? We can be in denial about some of the stuff. We can often be in denial about our own actions. We can sort of reconfigure our understanding of something that we remember without changing the events that happened in our mind, and so on and so forth. So for me, this was a really exciting way of addressing Keanu's rules and also the narrative, the narrative kind of conundrums that they threw up. So, and to your question, as I say, I think that these tendencies are being like massively exaggerated, but I don't think they're created out of nothing. It seems to me one of the things that goes on in digital spaces, social media, and so on, is a kind of terrifying, and I think largely damaging, very damaging acceleration of some of those kind of ambivalent and ambiguous tendencies within us as humans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also passing to anniversaries, ephemeris. In 2025, we have the 25th anniversary of the publication of Perdido Station, published in Spanish by Nova, like most of your novels. For the many fans of that world, including myself, how was Baslack born?
It's I know, I mean, it's obligatory for me to say at this point how extraordinary and strange it feels that it's 25 years old. I mean, I barely think of myself as 25 years old, so how that can be, I don't know. Um, Baslag was itself, the kind of early versions of it date from about 7 years before the publication of Paducah Street Station, and I was like a lot of nerds. I always, was interested in kind of world creation, and I started doing this world creation thing, always with a view to writing about it. And the way it was conceived for me was as a kind somewhere where I didn't need to have any discipline, and hopefully to make that something kind of exciting, so messy, but in a way that I hoped would be sort of vivid. By which I mean that I always conceived of Baslag as a kind of bag into which I just threw anything I liked. And then the idea was you throw it in and then you make it work logically afterwards. You don't sit there and try and kind of logically create a world. You do it the other way around. You put everything you want in there, and then you retrofit the logic by which it works. This is not a right thing or a wrong thing. There are different ways of doing this kind of world creation, and I'm certainly not suggesting that this is the only or the best way to do it, but it is a way. And it was because I remember thinking, well, what if I want a world in which there are creatures that look a lot like, Egyptian gods, and creatures from Russian folklore, and steam engines, and walking cactuses, and just because I like those ideas, I need to throw them in the bag and then work out the details afterwards. Mm-hmm. So it was always conceived of as almost like a commonplace book or something, like, somewhere, a scrapbook where you put everything you like, and then afterwards, part of the game is to try to create the threads and logic between them. Mm-hmm. Which is, to the extent that it works, and that's for readers to decide. It is an attempt to kind of create structure out of a very uninhibited, ill discipline.
Mm-hmm. Well, we need to talk about monsters because it's one of the themes in this year's festival, and your books are filled with them. Weaver, Slake Moths, A Bank and Time Golems in the Baslag trilogy, Smog in London, Mole Rats in Railsea, Imagos in the Tane, Manifs in the Last Days of New Paris. So which one is your favorite and why? And what do they represent to you?
I mean, some of those are not originally my monsters, obviously, like, the Avank, at least the word comes from folklore, and the Manifs are, in every case, literal representations of the exquisite corpses that the surrealists made and so on. But I mean, this is obviously an impossible question. I love all my children equally, but so there isn't a single answer, because I'm very excited by different monsters represent different moments of my life for me, and so there's something about the Weaver. I love the Weaver. I love the Weaver's poetic diction, and that has a big place in my heart. I loved being able to write the Manifs because I've wanted to write sort of an homage to surrealism for a very long time. I mean, an explicit one. Everything I've done has been an homage to surrealism. But I would say, I mean, so I can't say straightforwardly it's favorite. That's I have to hedge on that. But I would say that I am quite proud of the Ariake, because most of I've said before, something truly alien is literally impossible for a human to think. That's definitional to me. And so most aliens in science fiction and fantasy, or most monsters, are essentially some version of, assuming they're sapient, they are essentially some version of human wearing rubber makeup and a Star Trek mask or something. That's not a criticism. That's fine. But it is also interesting to try to write alien ways of thinking, so long as, in my opinion, you understand that you literally definitionally will fail. So the question only becomes like, how interestingly can you fail? And the Weaver was one of my first attempts to do that, to have a kind of very, very different way of cognition. And I really enjoyed that. And then in the case of the Ariete in Embassy Town, that was a slightly more disciplined attempt to kind of think through the logic of a mode of thinking that just, does not work the way a human model works. And to repeat, I know it fails, it cheats, but I don't think you cannot. And this is where I always quote Beckett, is that the aim is to fail better rather than to succeed.
Mm-hmm. Well, monsters inhabit not only horror and fantasy, but also magical realism and current Gothic narratives like the recent Latin American Gothic wave by female authors, as you know. What role do you think monsters play in current literature? And specifically, what is the role in the fantastic and in the new weird and the weird?
Well, this makes me realize I didn't answer the other point of your last question, which is what do the monsters represent? And I'm terrible at answering that question because my temptation is to say, but I don't want to play dumb. That's not to say that I don't, like, I have lots of ideas, but about what not just monsters, but things in general represent in fiction, and particularly in non-realist fiction and in fantastic fiction. But I think my hesitation comes because I think there's also always a surplus. And for me, what makes monsters in particular exciting is that surplus. There is a kind of fiction I really dislike, which is the fiction where the writer is so concerned about the metaphoric, or to put it more clearly, in my opinion, the allegorical meaning. So it's like that it creates this sense of kind of anxiety and nervousness. So it's kind of like there's almost a kind of neon sign over the book saying, well, like, don't worry, this is actually about something real and important, And to me, that's that there's something kind of craven about that I don't like. And that's not because I want to play this kind of childish, sort of dumb thing of saying, like, monsters don't mean anything. They're just cool toys. Of course they do, but they also mean themselves. They're also irreducible, and that's what's exciting about it. So this is why I like the fantastic fiction at its best, because there's also a lot of crap. But at its best, you have this kind of metaphor. And the thing about metaphor as opposed to allegory is metaphor is always spitting off more meanings. It has its kind of baseline, but it's always unstable. And it's also always irreducible. Mm-hmm. So, which is why any monster worth its salt is going to mean more than one thing, and also nothing but itself. Mm-hmm. And that to me is precisely the kind of it's not a paradox. What is it? That's the irreducibility of the fantastic that makes it such a rich register for me, and why I can't leave monsters alone. It's interesting to me that you mentioned. So that's my kind of general theory of how monsters work. It's a question of constantly adding "and" instead of, yes, Moby Dick means this and this and this and this, and also this and also this and also this, and it's also a huge whale, rather than saying it's not really about a whale, it's really about that. I obviously can't speak generally for any other writer. I mean, I can't speak generally for myself, but it's exciting to me that you have mentioned this recent wave that I've been really struck by, and like so many other people, I've been really profoundly sort of impressed and moved by Mariana Enriquez's work, and I'm going to butcher pronunciation, so forgive me. Particularly for me, I thought Monica Ojeda, is that how you say it? I thought, again in English, Jawbone, I thought was extraordinary, and particularly because I think in both of those cases, but particularly with Ojeda, there's something very irreducible about the monster and the monstrous, even though there is also clearly something profoundly meaningful about it. The chapter in that book where there's no spoilers, where one of the students writes an essay to her teacher explaining why she likes the kind of fiction she likes. I think it's like one of the best essays there has ever been on the weird in literature. It should be required reading.
Mm-hmm. I think you mentioned once that the story of monsters, the story of society is the story of its monsters.
Mm.
So
yeah, I mean, you go back in history. I mean, there is the history of the monstrous in human culture is fascinating to me. And there is a wonderful, brilliant book of archaeological theory that I would recommend by David Wengrow, which is called, I think, The Origin of Monsters. I think that's what it's called. Which is, I mean, just completely fascinating. But again, it isn't and can't be a theory of monsters. What it is a meta theory of monsters. It's about, like, the way, why they are, broadly speaking, powerful to think with, and and broadly speaking, the symbolic way in which they do what they do. But what they do is always infinitely specific. Mm-hmm. So yes, I do. I have not been able to discover any human culture that has not created fantastic creatures. I would be surprised if any exist, but certainly I am unaware of any, and I have gone looking.
Let's move on to the next question. And I know you have interesting relationship with this term, new weird. It's been applied to your work for when they were looking for a better label to label it. And I know you are not very keen to label your own work. So I would like to know, it's a personal question. I have curiosity. I'm very curious about it. What is your current relationship with the term new weird?
I don't really care. Now, I'm not ducking the question, but what I mean is, this is the kind of thing that other people get much more exercised about than I do. Mm-hmm. It is true when the term, as far as I know, was coined by M. John Harrison, when he very kindly and generously wrote something about something of mine, and I loved it. I thought it was a fabulous term, and I thought that it adverted to something interesting that was going on, and I briefly wrote something about it. And what then happened was to me, completely unsurprising and absolutely inevitable and normal life cycle of anything like that, which is that then very quickly there were ridiculously splenetic debates about it, and then very quickly it became a marketing term, and and my attitude to that is kind of like, well, sure, that's what always happens. We live in a commodified world. That's what happens. So I was interested in it because I thought it was a fun game, because I did think it actually genuinely was quite insightful about certain specificities of the fantastic that were happening at the time. And because it kind of referred to classic weird fiction, but also didn't reduce it to. So I thought it was fun. And then at the point at which people started literally using it as a marketing term and so on. And I don't mean this in a way of kind of like, oh no, they've ruined everything. And I'm like, this was always going to happen. It was going to happen. And the question is, does it happen in 1 month or 6? Fine. And I'm not, that was of no interest to me. And I don't care if it's of interest to other people. I'm not saying that's of no interest to me, so I now denounce it. Like, fine. Like, if you want to call my stuff new, fine. I don't care. But for me, I'm not particularly interested in that anymore. That's not a denunciation. It's not a disavowal. It's like, that was briefly something that I thought was really fun to think about, and now I don't anymore. And that's also fine.
Mm-hmm. It's fair, yeah. Another key element of your narrative is language. You're known not only for embracing neologisms, but also for creating characters who are closely tied to language. Belis in The Scar is a linguist, Avicii in Embassy Town is a living simile, and the ambassadors speak the language. And in The Last Days of New Paris, an artistic language comes to life. Is your use of language a way of immersing readers in the story while also questioning their understanding of it and inviting them to engage in the semantic game you propose?
I mean, this is one of those questions where I'm probably going to say I don't really know. But I was not like as often. I think one of the things that's interesting if you do this for long enough is you start to have pointed out to you things about your own stuff that you weren't necessarily conscious of. So I was not particularly aware of any specifically strong focus on language in my stuff until people started to suggest that was so, and at which point I sort of said, well, actually, I guess that's true. Now I do have a minor but existent sort of theoretical background in linguistics. I mean, very minor. But, as a social anthropology student, I studied some sociolinguistics and found that really fascinating. And I'm interested in various aspects of sort of linguistic theory. But I didn't set out at any point to, in the sense that like I was aware that I was writing things that were to some important degree about cities. I was not initially aware that I was writing things that were to some important degree to me about language. Individual novels, of course, by the time I wrote Embassy Town, I was very aware that this was a novel that was focused very, very specifically around linguistic concerns. Although I have always thought that it is at least as much to do with theology as linguistics. But, we can debate that. So I come at this question as someone, not as someone with a plan, but as someone trying to tease out a puzzle. And I think you're right to point it out. And to the extent that I am able to answer the question tentatively, I would say that it probably comes out of a general interest in language, of course. But I think for me, I've always really disliked and disagreed with the stricture and the tradition that suggests in George Orwell's famous formulation that like language is should be like a clear window. So what you're doing when you tell a story, you're trying to kind of, have a kind of a window that the point is to not see the language, but to see the stuff behind it. Now I'm reducing Orwell a bit, but there is a tendency in what he says that suggests that. And I really dislike that because I think it is, this is going to sound very pretentious, but like, what else is new? But like, I think that's bad philosophy. I don't think that's how language works. And as a reader, I was always interested in, as well as other things, I was interested in those traditions that kind of foreground language and that are aware of their own linguisticness. Whether that means in the pulp tradition, kind of a certain type of very almost overwrought prose that is very heavy with itself, or whether it means in the kind of avant-garde tradition like Oulipo or various surrealists, whether it means literally playing language games so that you are destabilizing the language itself, and I always found that really fascinating. So I was interested in trying to do things with the language rather than merely get it out of the way for the story. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the reasons I think that the people that don't like my stuff don't like my stuff. And that's fine. We're all, but if, and also because if you're trying to do something like that, it won't necessarily always work. You're intrinsically, you're trying something out. There's a question of experimentation, and experiments don't always succeed. And I think one of the things that I've been very lucky with, and I feel very grateful for, is the idea of not saying to your readers, stick with me, everything's going to work perfectly, but sort of trying to build up a relationship over various books where you say, look, I'm going to try something out, and I hope it works. And if it doesn't work, at least maybe it's an interesting failure, So I think maybe what underpins all that is just a sense of language as a real kind of as a material force, as a material part of the narrative itself, rather than as a kind of epiphenomenon. And so I think a lot of the things that you're talking about sort of stem from that.
Architecture is another recurring theme in your writing. New Corbusier, Armada, and the never-ending train in Baslag. Benzel and Ulcoma, the superimposed metropolis in the city, the hidden urban spaces in Kindrad, Kraken or Unlundun, the city train of Railsea, the organic houses of Embassy Town, the alternate Paris invaded by living art in the last days of New Paris, the hill house of this census taker, or even the oil rigs in Coventry, or the wall cracks in Details. Disrupting architectural structures thought to be solid and immutable seem to destabilize readers' expectations. What is your objective in doing so?
I mean, I'm going to say this a lot. I don't really know, but I will say that I have a very long standing interest in the kind of the ambivalences of the house and the idea of the house as, the house is like notionally a place of safety, but of course, very often isn't. And I've got in fact, I think my first ever published thing is my first published thing as an adult is a scholarly essay in the journal Historical Materialism. This has got to be 26 years ago now, maybe, which is called The Conspiracy of Architecture. And it's precisely about an attempt to kind of start theorizing about the cultural image of the predatory house, where the building itself becomes a predator. Because there's always something very interesting to me about a cultural symbol, which on the face of it is weirdly like contingent and yet crops up everywhere. So, for example, I'm really interested in like monsters that are made out of coagulated rubbish. You would have thought this is such a ridiculous idea. It could only ever come up like once in culture. It comes up all the time. Similarly, the idea of the house as a predator, you might think like, well, that's so oddly specific. Only one person is ever going to think of that. Not at all. It's very, very common. And so part of the question for me is like, when you have these counterintuitive but repetitive images, what are they doing? What do they mean? And I have a whole theory about that in that essay, but I think also just aesthetically, that sense of the, it's the uncanny, isn't it? It's the uncanniness of the house. And that ambiguity and that ambivalence is really interesting to me. I also think a lot of this, I want to be careful with this, but my hunch is that a lot of this comes from being the age I am and the demographic I am. Because if you grew up in London in the 1970s in a working class neighborhood, I remember there is a very, very profound sense of the specificity of architecture, and an architecture that is old, that is crumbling, that is home, but that is also like a bit moldy and not really fully safe, but also the only place to go, and that you have to pay rent, and that rent becomes part of the predation. And there's this whole and as a child, you don't have a kind of logical set of connections that mean you understand this, but you're very aware of them. You're very aware that these letters come that make your mother upset, or that this bit of the floor doesn't work properly, or whatever it might be. And I have a very, but I also grew up loving that. Like if I go, not loving the problems, but that particular kind of architecture to me codes as home because I grew up in it. So if I go to a kind of slightly rundown area between the center and the suburbs of London, there's a part of me that is instantly 6 years old again, and I'm sure like everywhere and everywhen has their own specificities about that. But I think for me, there was what I always think of as a kind of quotidian Gothic to 1970s London that really infected the house. And so I think a lot of my interest in architecture comes out of that.
Art plays an essential role in many of your books. Also, from the Capri art on Perdido Street Station. In fact, you dedicated a whole book to it in the last days of New Paris, where surrealism art invades the city during a military conflict. Are you trying to claim art as a social product that needs to be accessible to all? Or is this your way of criticizing how capitalism commodifies art?
Well, I mean, neither of the above, really. I mean, I suppose it's a criticism of commodification to the extent that everything I ever do, to some extent, is a critique of is a criticism of commodification, because I'm a socialist and I think commodification is the worst thing to be happening to human history. So that's always there. But the way the question is framed, and I understand that I don't that you're sort of putting it in very simple terms, but there is a danger of making these things sound as if the narratives are vectors for a particular point you want to make, and that is not the case at all. I am very interested in art. I have always been particularly, visual art in particular, two-dimensional art in particular, painting and drawing, have been very, very important to me. And I love them and I find them very inspiring, and I always have. And of course, I do have all of those, political and theoretical thoughts about them. And of course, those are important. But it's also just a question of, if you're trying to write a narrative about something that excites you, and one of the things that excites you is art, then it finds its way in there. Mm-hmm. But something like the Last Days of New Paris, there is I suppose I would say there is, for me, there is something playful and kind of almost kitsch about the political claims for art made in that book. Mm-hmm. I am actually, and that's part of the game with fiction, is that you can play around with ideas without necessarily being committed to them, mm-hmm. Or indeed in some cases, like there's aspects of Embassytown that are predicated on theories that I flatly disagree with, but I thought would be really interesting, in a book. And I am, as a person, like as a real person in the world, I'm extremely skeptical of some of the claims that are made about the kind of political importance of art, and the idea of art as activism or whatever. I am deeply skeptical. I think that's a kind of self-aggrandizement, and crucially also is to misunderstand what art does and doesn't do, what it the way it actually works. So of course I think art should be accessible to all, but like, what does that mean? That's something like Tony Blair would say that, and he can go fuck himself. So it's kind of like, what do we actually mean by this? So when I play around with these ideas in the books, first and foremost, this is like, I find these kinds of images very powerful, and they are part of my soul. Many kind of punctuating image. My childhood and my adulthood have been punctuated by certain images. I could write a wordless autobiography in like 20 images that have created me. I've written this before, so you may have seen it, but the image of the trout coming up underneath Jeremy Fisher in Beatrix Potter's book is one of the key things that made me. Now, I don't quite know why, but I know it's the case. And so some kind of attempt to kind of convey that sense of importance and the sense of excitement is what drives it. And then, of course, there's also ideas and playing around with thoughts and playing around with programs and so on. But that's secondary to essentially simply finding art very inspiring. Mm-hmm. I know that sounds quite wan, but I don't really know how else to put it.
You notoriously avoid following established trends, combining and reusing genres and tropes at will in search of new ways to represent and imagine the world. Do you think the fantastic genres imply a special way of relating to the world? And by smashing conventions, does it allow you to incisively criticize the establishment?
No. I think it would be nice if it were true, but I don't think it is. I think I do sometimes think there is something. I think a little part of me does believe that there is something sort of aesthetically and heuristically uniquely vivid and exciting about non-realist aesthetics that does do something. I'm nervous about that because that feels to me like a way of sort of a self-important justification, and also because so much actually existing fantastic art does nothing of the sort. And so I want to put that very, very cautiously. Um, I I do think that I find the fantastic aesthetic endlessly fascinating, and I think there are certain things you can do with it that you can't do with mimetic realism. For me, the end of Iron Council, the book Iron Council, was to me a kind of a project in attempting to find a way to make a set of sort of to posit a set of kind of political and aesthetic images that could not be done with the tools of realism, that could only be done with the tools of the fantastic. Again, how successful or not, that's for readers to judge. But that was so I do accept and believe, and I'm excited by the idea that there are specificities to the fantastic. And I would probably admit, although sheepishly and shyly, that I think they're more exciting than those of realism, and that ultimately you can do more with them. But of course, we're talking here about potential, not actually existing genres or whatever. And I think once that starts to get translated into, to go back to a previous answer, like the idea that in some way this is now translating in a relatively linear way to a kind of political intervention, I think it is completely bogus. Like when people start talking about, what we can learn for social activism from whatever, I sort of think like this is just not how this works. And you're either being self-important about the fiction, or you are setting yourself up for failure, or both. This is not the same as saying that, some people don't find certain texts or whatever politically inspiring, or and that's a different thing. But there are always so many levels of mediation that to think in terms of this directionality or this gravitational pull for a genre as a whole, I just think is or even an individual book beyond certain readers, I just don't think it works that way, sadly.
And you've said also that you need to plan the structure of each story as well as the plot, so that after you can refine them and focus on these specifics. Do you feel that your writing process has evolved over the years, and how?
I think it has. In some ways, I suppose it would be surprising if it didn't. I've been doing it for so long. I feel, it's still evolving, and in fact I think is evolving quite a lot at the moment in ways that I'm quite excited about. But I suppose I would say that I think it took me 20 years to kind of learn how to integrate writing with life in certain ways, and to write, how do I put this? So I find myself, there's still things I do that I've always done. Like I'm still a planner. I still do very, rigorous plans. I still, I still find a lot of the actual moment to moment writing very difficult. I'm not someone who loves every moment of writing. I'm someone who loves having written. But I get better at learning certain techniques and tricks and ways of being and rituals and so on. So, for example, at the moment, I'm doing a lot more drafting by hand. I write quite a lot of first drafts. The last few books, I've written more or less the whole first draft by hand, partly because for me, the great difficulty with writing, I think not just for me, but certainly for me, is the sort of, that kind of the freeze that a certain kind of perfectionism can create. And the thing is, if you're writing by hand, especially if, like me, you have very bad handwriting, you can tell yourself, well, I'm just scribbling some nonsense. I'm just scribbling something, it's not real. So it's always for me about trying to write a book behind your own back. And I find that useful. And I also find as I get older and I get, I guess, happier, as I get, slightly more in my skin, I find it easier to to have a certain kind of, I wouldn't say easier, but I'm calmer about the discipline of turning off all connectivity for 3 or 4 hours and just, that kind of thing. I've also, silly little tricks like, for fully 15, 20 years, I would try and write, but I would say like, first of all, I'm going to clear all my decks. So I'll do all my admin and all my email and all that first, and then I'll try and write. It's like stupid. So, and it took me until I was in my 40s to realize that I should do the writing first thing and not do anything, really stupid stuff. And I these are the things that I wish, mostly I try not to get too, I'm quite relaxed about, the aging process and so on. But I do wish that I could go back in time and tell myself a few things. And that's one of them. It's just like first thing in the morning, silly little things like that.
You've referred to Borges y Magos in the Tain, as well as to Spanish names like Perdido in Perdido Street Station, Armada in The Scar, and the notorious Spanish dancer in Embassy Town. What Spanish or Latin American literary works have inspired you, and what about other artistic disciplines?
Well, literature, in particular Borges, Cortázar, Ocampo, that axis very much. It can tip into a kind of fairy tale feeling, which interests me less. But when it's at its most kind of distilled and strange, I love it very, very, very much. So who else would I say? Lorca. I mean, Bernarda Alba is a very large. I saw it when I was very young, and it has taken up a lot of my mental space. That tradition. I know Lorca is obviously a bit different, but I would say that in terms of visual art, there's a lot. If anything, actually, probably more than with the writing. Goya, most obviously, but a lot of the Spanish and Spanish-speaking surrealists, Mata, Oscar Dominguez, Remedios Varo, and then going further back a little bit, there's the sort of Cusco school paintings and stuff. These loom quite large. But of all of those names, I would say Goya and Borges are the two that loom largest.
And have you visited Spain?
Yes, but not for many years. But I have been to Spain, yes.
I also would like to know if you can share anything of your current projects, perhaps the story you've been working on for 19 years.
Yeah, coming up on 20. Well, I'm not. I mean, I'm nearly done. I'm doing final edits on this book that is the kind of the last project that is from that earlier part of my life when I wrote in a very different way. And it's very melancholy and very strange because it has, it was a book that grew and grew both physically, but also in terms of its weight. And, I thought it was about one specific thing, and it has become about everything. This, this is very exciting to me, but it's also extremely nerve-wracking, not least because those kind of projects that become so intensely personal, to some extent, how can they possibly live up to the weight of what they are in your head, So again, as with everything I ever do, I hope it is a success, but I will be grateful if it achieves, if it fails at that, but it becomes an honorable, interesting failure, that I will accept, gladly and gratefully. So that is a long, difficult book, difficult for me, I mean, that is very near completion. And then I have a couple of other things that I've started working on for after that, but these are in quite early stages, and these are exciting to me because they will be the first things that I have written completely free of this last thing that ties me to my very young self.
Okay.
I realize I'm speaking very obliquely, but I'm quite superstitious about talking about work in progress. I would, but yes, but this is an important moment for me because once this is done, I don't know who I'll be, which is exciting.
And a quick curiosity. In an interview, I read that you were theorizing about the indivisible unit of a narrative. Have you found it?
Nope. I say a lot of stuff in interviews, and I want to be clear. I'm not lying, and I'm not just bullshitting, and I'm not but one has a lot of ideas, like all of us, like ideas come into our head. Like I'm sure in that moment, like that was the most fascinating thing in the world to me. And I do remember thinking about it and thinking, but of course, what a ridiculous project. How could you possibly do that? So no, but it was an honorable failure and it was interesting and it made me think about, actually I see quite a lot of the ruminations on that in Embassy Town and to a lesser extent in London. So no, but that doesn't mean I didn't get anything out of it.
Well, thank you so much for this interview for the festival. I know that you're a busy man and wanted to thank you from the organization for everybody involved in this festival. And I hope that one day we can maybe have the opportunity to talk to you in person.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you for the great honor that you all do me in having my stuff feature as part of this. I don't take it lightly, and I'm very grateful. And I hope the festival is wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you very much.